Pursuant to House Resolution 5, the bill is considered read. The bill shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the majority leader and minority leader or their respective designees. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members
from Ohio.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 26.
Without objections.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 26, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. In simple terms, life is precious, life is sacred, all life, and we think including unborn children. But that's not what this legislation is about. This legislation is about those kids who were born alive, making sure they get protected. For over 40 years, the decision in Roe v. Wade, as Justice Alito has stated, inflamed debate and deepened division over the issue of abortion in this country. We've seen that play out over the last year. But what should be undisputed is the care of a child who is born alive after an attempted abortion. Unfortunately, as evidenced by comments from prominent Democrats, not everyone believes that a child born alive should be protected. We all know in 2019, then Governor Northam of the state of Virginia stated this: the infant would be delivered, the infant would be kept comfortable, the infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired, and then a discussion would ensure between the physicians and the mother. I mean, think about that. It's not just anybody saying that. That's the governor of one of our largest states. The cavalier attitude he displayed towards human life is just wrong. H.R. 26 would require healthcare practitioners to give the same level of care to a child born alive after an abortion or an attempted abortion as a child at that same gestational age. Work to save the kid's life. Work to help that newborn. It would also require the immediate transfer of the surviving infant to a hospital. This legislation requires healthcare practitioners or other employees to report any violations of this provision to state or federal law enforcement for criminal prosecution. In addition, H.R. 26 provides the mother of an abortion survivor with a civil right of action against a healthcare practitioner who fails to provide the required level of care. It is simple. Infants born alive following an abortion are kids. They're children. All newborns deserve the same level of care. In the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers declared that it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the unalienable rights bestowed on us by our Creator. Congress has a duty to protect these fundamental rights. This should be an easy vote, I think, for all members. And I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Ann Wagner and Kat Kamik, for their diligent work on this legislation, and I urge all members to support it. And with that, we reserve our time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 26, the so-called Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Despite what its supporters would have us believe, this legislation would do nothing to enhance protections or the quality of health care if an infant is born after an attempted abortion. What it would do, however, is directly interfere with a doctor's medical judgment and dictate a medical standard of care that may not be appropriate in all circumstances, which could in fact put infants' lives at greater risk. Finally, by beginning this new Congress with a bill to restrict women's health care nationwide, House Republicans have made clear that they will not stop until they reach their ultimate goal, a nationwide ban on abortion. It has always been the law that health care providers cannot deliberately harm newborn infants, and that they must exercise reasonable care in their treatment of such infants. The bill's implication that providers who perform abortions routinely act in a callous or criminal manner that would result in an infant's death, or that a provider who performs an abortion somehow cannot be trusted to take adequate measures to save a living baby's life, is insulting and untrue. In opposing this bill, I do not oppose in any way proper medical treatment for newborn infants, whatever the circumstances of their birth. But determining the proper treatment is for medical professionals to decide, not politicians in Congress. When I supported the Born Alive Infant Protection Act in 2002, my reasoning and the reasoning of my pro-choice colleagues was simple. Killing an infant who is born alive, either by an act of omission or commission, is infanticide. It was, is, and always should be against the law, and we saw no harm in reaffirming that fact. That law passed Congress with bipartisan support precisely because it was harmless, even if it was also useless, since it did not change the pre-existing law in any way, because after all, murder is murder in every state. The bill specifically just reiterated existing law in florid language and did nothing to interfere with doctors' medical judgment or to cause needless harm. Unfortunately, the bill before us today puts children's lives and health at risk. It requires doctors to immediately ensure transportation and admission of the infant to a hospital in all cases, with no regard as to whether doing so is actually in the best interest of the child's health and well-being. This mandate effectively overrides the careful case-by-case exercise of professional medical judgment by healthcare providers and replaces it with a blanket rule enforceable with criminal penalties. It may be, after all, in a given case, that it is more beneficial to the infant's health to be treated on the spot and not rushed to a hospital immediately. Such a ham-fisted approach fails to consider the fact that in many cases it may be safer and more conducive to the infant's health to care for the infant where it was born, rather than transporting it many miles away to a hospital. But this bill assumes that Congress knows better, and it imposes a new obligation on providers that, rather than saving lives, puts infants at risk. Perhaps if this bill had gone through regular order, we could have avoided this unfortunate situation. But there has never been a committee markup or a hearing on this bill, not in this Congress, nor in any previous Congress. I would have welcomed the opportunity to hear from expert witnesses on best practices and standards of care for infants. Members could have offered amendments and perfected the bill to ensure that it achieves our common goal of providing the best, most medically appropriate care to infants and their mothers. I am disappointed, but not surprised, that my colleagues rushed this bill to the floor when there is no evidence at all that doctors currently are failing to provide an appropriate level of care, and when a chorus of provider groups oppose this bill. Sadly, rather than protecting infants, my Republican colleagues are putting them at greater risk in the service of politics. Indeed, by bringing this bill straight to the floor as one of the first measures to be considered by the 118th Congress, excuse me, Republicans and the most extreme elements of the anti-abortion movement have signaled their determination to enact a nationwide ban on abortion. I cannot support H.R. 26 because it mandates a particular course of treatment, immediate transport to a hospital, which may not be appropriate and may be medically dangerous in certain cases. In doing so, it abandons the practice of considering the best medical interests of infants and their mothers. Republicans have made clear where they stand about a woman's right to control her body. Make no mistake, this bill is another step in their plan to criminalize abortion nationwide. I urge my colleagues to reject this ill-conceived legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserved. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just point out this bill has passed multiple times in previous Congresses, the exact same language, and it is passed with bipartisan support. I now want to yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of the legislation, who has worked tirelessly on this good piece of legislation, the gentlelady from the state of Missouri.
The gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Speaker. And again, I thank my good friend and colleague, a champion for life, our chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan. I rise today, Madam Speaker, in support of H.R. 26, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. I have championed this issue for decades, and I have been blessed and honored to lead this legislation since 2019. I am so grateful to the co-leads of this bill, Representatives Kat Cammack and our majority leader, Steve Scalise. Also to the leadership of this Congress, and especially to the thousands of champions of life across the country for their tireless work and support of the most vulnerable Americans, unborn and newborn infants. Thanks to these efforts, after dozens of unanimous consent requests, 2 discharge petitions, and countless hours of advocacy work, the House will at last take action to ensure that every single baby born in the United States receives life-saving medical care at their most vulnerable moment. All children should be welcomed with joy and wonder, no matter the circumstances of their birth. And yet too many of these sweet little ones are denied the medical care they need to survive and thrive simply because they were unwanted. This common sense legislation will require healthcare providers to administer the same level of care to the babies who survive abortions that they would to any other child born at the same gestational age. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will again join me in supporting the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, as some did, as our chairman mentioned, when it passed the House in both 2015 and 2018 with bipartisan support. To that point, I want to be absolutely clear that this bill has nothing to do with the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs to return abortion to the states. And not a word of the Born Alive Act obstructs states' abilities to implement Dobbs as they see fit. I strongly believe that states should control pro-life policymaking, just as I support exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother. But today, we are considering an entirely separate issue. We're considering the protection of infants that have been delivered alive after an attempted abortion. That's it, plain and simple. I implore my Democratic colleagues to put aside politics and stand in support of life-saving care for these innocent newborns. We must remember today that children are not the only victims of born-alive abortions. Women, fathers, and whole families all suffer deeply from the loss of their child. Our communities are weaker because these bright young ones did not grow up to share their wisdom, their laughter, and ingenuity with all of us. Just down the hall, a little bit later this afternoon, we will meet with extraordinary women who survived abortions. When they entered the world, they were not greeted with the profound love and awe that I felt when I held my children and grandchildren for the first time. Instead, they were left to die. They are alive today because of the courage and the grace, mostly of nurses who chose to act as they struggled for breath. Each of these women has built a happy, healthy life, bringing light and joy to their friends and families and enriching their communities. They inspire us all. As a mother and grandmother, they affirm my belief in a culture of life for children, born and unborn, and their mothers and families. Every single newborn, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, deserves to share the miracle of life and have life-saving medical care. We must act with compassion to protect these little ones and give women a strong support system as they navigate the miracles and challenges of motherhood. This bill will save real lives, and it will give survivors a precious chance to build a future. I urge every member of the House to vote yes on H.R. 26, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Minority Leader of the House, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
The Minority Leader is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the distinguished gentleman from New York for yielding, all of my colleagues for their continued leadership on this incredibly important issue. The 118th Congress has begun, and the differences between Our side of the aisle and the other side of the aisle couldn't be any clearer. Now, let me, of course, reiterate that as Democrats, we look forward to trying to find common ground whenever and wherever possible to solve issues of consequence on behalf of the American people, but we will oppose extremism whenever it rears its ugly head. Democrats have made clear we are going to continue to work on issues like lower costs, better paying jobs, safer communities, defend democracy, protect the public interest, ensure economic opportunity in every single zip code, and yes, fight for reproductive freedom. My Republican colleagues, you promised to come to Washington to fight for the American people, but have spent a lot of time fighting each other on politics, power, and personality, not working on issues related to the public interest. That's what the last few days have indicated, an extreme MAGA Republican agenda. Now that you are getting into substance, on Monday, you pass a bill designed to allow the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected to cheat on their taxes, subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless, benefit millionaires and billionaires, not working-class families, not middle-class families, not low-income families, not veterans, not everyday Americans, the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. That was on Monday. Then on Tuesday, you come to the floor and you pass a select committee on insurrection protection, a committee that is clearly designed, in the words of some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, to obstruct justice as part of your evident desire, as many of you have said, to eventually defund the FBI. That was Tuesday. And now on Wednesday, you come to the floor. Nothing on inflation, nothing on quality of life issues for the American people, nothing even on public safety. But you come to the floor as part of your march to criminalize abortion care, to impose a nationwide ban, to set into motion government-mandated pregnancies. So that's the distinction for today. As Democrats, we believe in a woman's freedom to make her own reproductive health care decisions. Period, full stop. A decision that should be between a woman, her family, and her doctors. Period, full stop. We believe in Roe v. Wade. You wonder about our position? That's it. The Women's Health Protection Act. That's it. Freedom to make your own reproductive health care decisions. That's it. As compared to a clear effort, that's what this bill is about today, a march toward criminalizing abortion care. A nationwide ban, government-mandated pregnancies, part of an extreme MAGA Republican agenda. And so, yes, we continue to extend our hand of partnership if you truly want to work on quality of life issues. But we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it on Monday, we haven't seen it on Tuesday, and we're not seeing it today. So we oppose this bill, we oppose an extreme MAGA Republican agenda, and let's get back to the business of the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves, the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just point out the minority leader said their position is Roe v. Wade. Their position is real simple, and it's real radical. Their position is you should be able to take the life of an unborn child right up until their birthday, and then, as Governor Northam has said, even after their birthday, and that's what this bill seeks to stop and make sure doesn't happen. So that's as radical as you can get, taking the life of unborn children right up to their birthday. And then, as Governor Northam has pointed out, even after that. We want to make sure that even after that part never happens, because we believe life is precious and life is sacred. And I would yield now to one of the authors of this, co-sponsor of this legislation, the gentlelady from the state of Florida, Ms. Kamick. 3 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 26, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. And this bill does exactly what the title says, which in this town is a novel concept. I'd like to thank my colleague, Ann Wagner, for her tireless efforts. I'd like to thank our Majority Leader, Steve Scalise, for his efforts on this issue, and of course, Chairman Jim Jordan of the Judiciary Committee for being such an advocate for the pro-life community. Today, we are not talking about abortion. We are talking about children. We are talking about children who have been born and are fighting to survive despite an abortion attempt. In some cases, when a woman receives a late-term abortion, the baby can be born alive following the procedure. Federal law currently recognizes these babies as persons, but fails to outline any requirements of care after the infant is born alive. H.R. 26 would rectify this by requiring healthcare practitioners to treat any child born alive after an abortion as they would any infant, and requires that the infant be immediately treated with life-saving care and transported to a hospital. I honestly do not understand what is so controversial about that. This bill establishes criminal penalties for any healthcare practitioner or abortion clinic employee who fails to comply with the requirements established by this bill, because let's face it, no one can deny that a child who survives an abortion attempt, who is outside the womb, breathing and struggling for life despite all attempts to end it, doesn't deserve equal protection under the law, and under our law, murder is illegal. That shouldn't be a controversial position. 8 babies in Florida alone, just last year, 8 babies were reported to have been born alive during an abortion attempt. The stories are horrific. One that sticks out in particular, an NBC report in 2006. They told the story of a 23-week-old baby boy that was born alive at an abortion clinic in Hialeah, Florida. When he began breathing and moving, the abortion clinic owner, Belkis Gonzalez, reportedly cut the umbilical cord and zipped him into a biohazard bag, where he then died. It's hard to read those words, but as has been stated here, on this floor, in this chamber, this isn't about pro-life versus pro-choice. This is about protecting those most vulnerable. It's about who we are as a society, who we are as a people, and who we are as Americans. I hope that both sides of this chamber can agree that accountability is a good thing. Protecting these children is a good thing. It is time to put the party politics aside and the talking points aside and give these children, wanted or unwanted, a fighting chance, a chance that they all deserve. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. And the chair wants to remind our members to direct all their remarks to the chair. You're recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Dean.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is a crime now to kill a child born alive. In fact, in May of 2013, a Philadelphia man was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of 3 infants. He's now serving life without parole. Either my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are unaware of this already existing crime with a penalty of life without parole, or this is another extreme political stunt. Let me be clear. Abortion care is health care, and that has been true for a very long time. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not interested in medical truths. No, instead they are interested in scaring people, outlawing all abortions, and criminalizing anyone they can. Politicians have no business making unsound medical decisions. We are legislators, not doctors. And in the unfortunate case when a child is born with fatal disabilities, this legislation will deny parents a say in how their child spends the final minutes, hours, or days of his or her life, whether hooked up to a medical device or in the arms of his parents. Expecting parents have enough worries. They should not have to worry about extreme politicians in their doctor's office or hospital, thinking they somehow know better. I urge my colleagues to vote no on H.R. 26.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was a corpsman, that is a combat medic, in the Navy SEAL teams for over 20 years, and I'd like to give you a different perspective. If I were to encounter an enemy combatant on the battlefield who was wounded, which I have, I was obligated by international law to render medical care to that enemy combatant to the best of my ability, up to and including to the detriment of my own troops, or I would be subject to prosecution. I find it absurd. I find it unconscionable that this would be a matter of discussion on this body, that we would not render medical aid to the most innocent amongst us, an unborn child that is born alive after the most traumatic circumstances possible. So I would implore my Democratic colleagues to remember that this is not about a woman's access to abortion. This is about the sanctity of life and the basic dignity of a human child. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Scanlon.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to oppose this grotesque attempt to politicize abortion care and criminalize doctors. Politicians should not be in the business of mandating that women carry dangerous or unwanted pregnancies to term. And they should stay out of the doctor's office when Americans are exercising their fundamental right to decide when or if to have children. But right-wing extremists have made it their first order of business in this new Congress to attack abortion rights and spread disinformation. This bill is deliberately misleading. It's harmful to both people facing pregnancy complications and to the doctors who provide their care. If passed, it would cause more maternal deaths in this country, which are already a national shame. Congress has a responsibility to legislate honestly, and this bill is not honest. The American people deserve better than having Congress waste time on political stunts pretending to fix problems that do not exist. Americans don't want MAGA extremists to criminalize women's health care, and they don't want politicians in their doctors' offices. With that, I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, my friend, Mr.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 1 minute.
Appreciate my friend Chairman Jordan yielding to me, and I want to thank my friend Representative Ann Wagner for introducing this important bill again. I think no better person than a mama and a grandmama, so she does a good job at both of those. Madam Speaker, babies deserve a chance to live. They deserve a chance at life, no matter their age or their circumstances. The Constitution says that people have a right to life. The science says babies are people. But the Democrats have been pushing trust the science, follow the science, trust the science, follow the science for the last 2 years, yet we are denying the science, Madam Speaker. When I was a little boy, I was asking my mama, we were talking about abortion, and we were talking about babies being born, maybe that were disabled or had some other anomaly. And she said to me, I said, Mama, what would we do if one of those babies was born, if I was the father of one of those little babies? And she said, honey, we just love that baby just a little more. Madam Speaker, we need to love those babies a little more and not murder them. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Connecticut, the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in strong opposition to the latest attempt by House Republicans to control women's reproductive freedom, a ruse to ban safe and legal abortions in this country. This legislation purposes to address nothing, something that does not happen. The hypotheticals some of my colleagues described are not based in fact. Their arguments are untrue. They do not represent how medicine actually works. Their suggestions are not only false, but they're callous. The truth is, abortions that occur after 3 months of pregnancy account for only 1% of all abortions. They occur almost exclusively because a woman's life is at risk. Her pregnancy is not viable. We should not be in the business of enacting laws that make these difficult and painful situations worse. What is not hypothetical is the real pain and suffering that politicians across this country are imposing as they continue to chip away at what should be an essential right. A woman must have the right to make health decisions that are in the best interest of themselves, their family, and their circumstances. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this sham piece of legislation and yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It sounds really good to call you Mr. Chairman. You're going to do a great job for us, for the American people, more importantly. I rise today in support of H.R. 26, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Since my first year in office, I've shown a strong commitment to promoting a culture of life. The bill before us requires practitioners who are present for an attempted abortion resulting in a live birth to exercise the same degree of care that would be offered to any other child born of that gestational age. After those efforts, the healthcare workers must admit the child to a hospital. This bill also gives mothers a civil action, cause of action, and protection from any prosecution, recognizing that women are the second victims of abortion and attempted abortions. I urge all my colleagues to support this important piece of legislation because surely we can all agree that a child born alive has a right to live. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
I would say, here we go again. For those of us who've served in the United States Congress, this is here we go again. This is legislation that is attempting to be wrapped in mercy, that is without mercy. First of all, it is without fact. It is extremely important to know that if you are here in the United States Congress, you know the history, because we've already passed the bipartisan Born Alive Infant Protection Act, which reiterates the fact that it is illegal to interfere with a newborn. They are protected from both intentional harm by healthcare performers and harm from medical negligence. Plain and simple, period at the end of the sentence. So why are we here today? We're here today for news clips. We're here today for quotes and condemnation of that other side of the aisle that wants to be reckless with the life of a child. I can assure you that those of us who have given birth, those of us who have lost in the birth process, are extreme lovers of those wonderful opportunities of life. I refuse and reject a condemnation of my personal self because I believe these decisions are with a God, the woman's God, the family's God, her faith, doctors, and of course, the persons who are a part of the medical profession. I have article after article that talks about the tragedy of partial birth abortion, the name used more than a decade ago. You see, they always find creative names to be able to be criminalized. We heard from a member from a rural community that said, how dare you grab up the child, put them in an ambulance to take them hundreds of miles away from that family. Or maybe the family who found out that the multiple abnormalities of their child would not allow them to live. And they had waited 8 years for this wonderful baby. The decisions, unfortunately, neither life nor death come easily for these children. There's a painful existence marked by periods of breathing cessation and seizures when they are born. Because of my OB was unable to get a good image of the brain until the 13th week, we understand that these are personal decisions. We understand that these are painful decisions. So I stand with those families. I refuse to condemn those families, and I refuse to be merciless. I'm giving mercy and voting against this legislation, voting against it now.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller-Meeks.
The gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 26, and I want to thank my colleague, the Chair of Judiciary from Ohio, for yielding me time. As a mother, a doctor, a former nurse, and the former director of Iowa's Department of Public Health, I know firsthand the preciousness of life and the importance of neonatal care and the tragedies that ensue when proper care isn't provided. In fact, the first healthy baby I delivered as a doctor was to a young teenager who put the baby up for adoption. Our nation promises three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. There is no clause in the Constitution to exempt newborns who survive an abortion procedure from these rights. It is not only reasonable and unreasonable, but inhumane to deny care to babies who were born alive. Regardless of maternal intent, what could be more extreme than denying care to an infant born alive? My colleague on the other side of the aisle from New York is correct. It is infanticide. H.R. 26 is legislation that would receive wide support from both sides of the aisle. It is unconscionable to think that some members will choose to vote against this bill, which will ensure infants receive life-saving care simply because of partisan politics. This legislation isn't about banning abortions, but saving the lives of living, breathing, innocent newborns. Many states, including Iowa, have put safe haven laws in place to allow parents to leave their infants at hospitals or care facilities without fear of being prosecuted. We already have laws in place to protect these infants. Why should infants who survive an abortion be treated any differently? Like all other medical professionals, I took the Hippocratic Oath, which promises that I will do no harm. This legislation reaffirms the Hippocratic Oath and ensures that doctors across the United States are providing the same standard of medical care to all infants, regardless of the circumstance of their birth. I urge all of my colleagues to stand and support life by voting for H.R. 26. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, colleague. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
My. Here we go again. Republicans are racing full steam to criminalize abortion nationwide. Madam Speaker, the American people want women, not politicians, to make their own health care decisions, including those about abortion. So as to this misleading, offensively named bill, let's vote it down and let's say no to putting women's lives in danger, no to denying patients needed life-saving care, and no to putting health care providers in prison for doing their job. Madam Speaker, because I love my grandchildren, I reject the extreme Republican agenda, and I'm standing here today with the Democrats for people to have the freedom to make their own personal decisions about their health, their life, and their future. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader of the House, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
The Majority Leader is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Ohio for yielding. I want to especially thank gentlelady from Missouri, Ann Wagner, for leading this effort for so many years. I am so proud to rise in support of this bill that is about human dignity, and frankly, it's about common sense. The idea, Madam Speaker, that if a baby is born alive outside the womb, that baby in America could be killed and called abortion, not murder, defies logic. It defies humanity. In fact, when I've talked about this bill to other people over the years that Kat Kamek has had a discharge petition to bring to the floor, and so many others all across the country have asked Congress to address, the first thing that people express is shock. They say, wait a minute, if the baby's born alive outside the womb, alive, how could you kill that baby and that be legal? How is that not already murder? I questioned how it wasn't myself. And yet in a number of states, it is legal and happening today. This is America. You see countries like China and North Korea. There aren't many countries in the world that allow this practice. The United States should not be one of those countries. This is inhumane. This transcends the abortion debate. Before the Dobbs decision, this bill still would have been constitutional to pass, because we're not talking about 20 weeks. We're talking about the baby born alive outside the womb. And yet, in America, there are some states that allow that baby to be killed and called abortion. You can call it whatever you want. It should be murder. It shouldn't be allowed. And this bill takes care of that. Everybody should vote for this bill. When you talk to people that identify as pro-choice, they're shocked that this is a legal process, so many of them. Some obviously still want it to continue, but we shouldn't. We should be better than that as a country. There's an amazing group called the Abortion Survivors Network. I've met, so many of us, Ann Wagner surely met with some of these incredible people. You want to talk about a walking miracle. These are people alive today in their 20s, 30s, 40s, living incredible lives, who were the result of an abortion that wasn't successful. They lived through it. Think of the special plan God has for them, that they survived an abortion, and they're alive today. And they're incredible people. Everybody in this country should reach out and go meet them. It's a group, you can look them up. And their stories are incredible. Why should they be denied life? We're a country of laws. We're a country of great rights, our inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The first among those is life. If you're born alive in this country, again, very few countries in the world allow this to happen to someone born alive. So while there's shock when people find out that it's legal, we're the United States Congress. We can actually do something about it. Thank God we have people that are willing to stand up for those babies. Not even talking about inside the womb, outside the womb, born alive. If someone takes their life after they're born alive outside the womb, that should be murder. We should be protecting those young babies. That's what this bill does. It's a bill we should all be proud to support. It's a list that the United States should want to take itself off of. We shouldn't want to be associated with the very few countries who allow this barbaric practice to happen. Let's pass this bill. Let's become an even more perfect union. I yield back the balance of my time.
The majority leader yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Scalise and every other Republican who has spoken on this bill is simply wrong on the facts. It is illegal and always has been illegal in every state and then federal law to kill an infant born alive. It is illegal and always has been illegal not to provide that infant with appropriate medical care. And just to make sure that no one had any doubts of that, we passed the Born Alive Infant Protection Act with bipartisan support in 2002. The problem with this bill is not that it makes anything, that it is not that it provides any new protections for infants. The problem with this bill is that it endangers some infants by stating that that infant must immediately be brought to the hospital, where, depending on the circumstances, that may be the right thing to do for the health and survival of that infant, or it may not. That is the problem with this bill. It directs and mandates a certain medical care which may not be appropriate, which may be endanger the life of an infant in certain circumstances. That's why we oppose this bill, not because we don't think that babies born alive must be saved, but because we do think that babies born alive must be saved. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
The woman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This bill is extremist, dangerous, and unnecessary. Extremist because it would criminalize doctors with up to 5 years in prison and put them in fear of providing life-saving medically necessary procedures to those who are pregnant. Dangerous because the bill has no exceptions to protect the health of the patient and no exception for cases where there is a serious fetal anomaly. And unnecessary because, as Mr. Nadler said, it's already a crime to kill a baby born alive. Many of my Republican colleagues talk about keeping big government out of people's lives, but when it comes to one of the hardest, most intimate decisions that should be made between patients and their healthcare providers, these same colleagues think the government knows better. Republicans in Congress and conservative extremists on the Supreme Court are waging a war on reproductive health care, a war on bodily autonomy, and a war on the medical community and the doctor-patient relationship. I will continue to stand up against these assaults on reproductive freedom and against extremist, dangerous, unnecessary, and misguided policies like this bill. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
We reserve.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Fletcher.
The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 26 and to its very name, because it is not about what House Republicans claim it's about. Because what they claim it is about isn't a thing. What this bill is about is an assault on the health, rights, equality, and dignity of American women and the people who provide their reproductive health care. It's an assault we've seen in my home state of Texas, where women having miscarriages are being turned away from the hospitals and told to come back when they are closer to dying, where doctors fear and are told that they cannot meet the standard of care for their patients. Providers and patients are afraid of misleading bills like this one, criminalizing health care. But of course, that's the point, isn't it? I stand here today, and I will stand here every day to oppose this bill and others like it, to talk about the real healthcare crisis facing women today, and to urge my colleagues to vote no. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
H.R. 26 would rob families of the ability to make difficult, complicated medical decisions in some of the most heartbreaking circumstances imaginable. It is a mean-spirited solution in search of a problem. If the majority is interested in caring for newborns, I invite them to support Democrats' efforts to provide paid family leave to every new parent. Republicans are welcome to join our efforts to expand the child tax credit to families struggling with paying the bills. And we would be thrilled to have bipartisan support in this chamber to make child care affordable everywhere. Alternatively, House Republicans have brought up a bill designed to intimidate doctors and perpetuate disinformation about how abortion care actually works. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Instead, vote yes on the motion to recommit, which would bring up my bill, the Women's Health Protection Act, legislation that would create a federal right to abortion care free from medically unnecessary restrictions in all 50 states.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Adderholt.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, my friend and colleague, Chairman of the Judiciary, for yielding this time. As I've said before, we'll continue to say I am pro-life, I'm pro-family, and pro-child. And I'm very proud to see that one of the very first pieces of legislation that comes before this Congress and the new majority is protecting the vulnerable. And that's something I've always stood up for since my first time here in Congress. But it seems like there is some confusion, especially on the other side of the aisle, Madam Speaker, about what this legislation is about. This legislation is very simple. It simply states and ensures that babies who survive an abortion receive the care and protection that they are not discarded because someone else had intended in their lives. It prohibits health care practitioners from turning a blind eye to abortion survivors. No matter the intent of what you believe about life, failure to care for an unborn child is infanticide, and the law must be enforced. I would ask my colleagues to remember that the last time we voted on this bill, it was a bipartisan support, and I would ask again for support for this common sense, life-saving legislation.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Born alive has nothing to do with abortion. Providers are already required by law to provide appropriate medical care. Infanticide is murder. And what we heard earlier is just not true. It is a lie that should not be repeated. As our chairman had said, not only is it illegal to not care for a born infant, but the law that you have provided on the Republican side actually can create more harm. It requires immediately taking a struggling baby to a hospital. That hospital could be hours away and could be detrimental to the life of that baby. This is nothing more than the part of the effort to make abortion illegal nationally in this country. I object, and I urge a no vote and yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Indiana for her first speech on the House floor. Ms. Houchin.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Jordan, for yielding your time. I rise today in support of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. From New Albany to Salem to Madison, Hoosiers across southern Indiana feel, as I do, that every life is precious and all lives deserve the dignity and respect of life-saving care. That's why I'm proud to stand alongside my colleagues in support of this pro-life bill. This legislation would ensure that children who are born alive despite an attempted abortion are given the same medical care and help as any other newborn infant. We know the majority of Americans agree that on this issue, saving the lives of babies who survive a botched abortion is not just humane, it's necessary and foundational to our constitutional right to life. It's why I'm an original co-sponsor on this important bill to support mothers and their children. I stand with Hoosiers on behalf of these vulnerable infants. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, Democrats support the radical position of abortion on demand up until birth, funded by the taxpayers. And they would even deny an innocent child care that miraculously survives a botched abortion. This is a common sense support for life. I urge the rest of my colleagues to stand with us in defending life. On this issue, we should all agree. I yield back my time. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
The gentleman from New York
Thank
is
you, Mr.
recognized
Chairman.
for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to talk about freedom, a core American value, specifically individual freedom, a value that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have for years co-opted, weaponized, and distorted. I simply do not understand how my Republican colleagues can demand the individual's freedom to spread a deadly disease to other people by not getting vaccinated or wearing masks, yet have the gall to deny the individual freedom to make decisions about one's own body that has no impact on anyone else. How can it be that autonomy to wear a mask or not is of greater importance than the autonomy over whether to have a baby or not? Let me say it plainly. We cannot talk about preserving our individual freedoms while simultaneously ripping away a fundamental freedom for women in this country. Control over one's reproductive health is a human right. We are in the first week of Congress, and what are we focused on? Is it to fight inflation? No. Create jobs for Americans? No. To protect children from gun violence? No. It's to continue the assault on our autonomy, on women's autonomy. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, a longtime champion for the pro-life cause, Mr. Smith.
I thank my good friend for yielding, and I thank Ann Wagner for offering this
Gentleman from New Jersey is
important
recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, in a Florida abortion clinic, Stockloria Williams delivered a live baby girl at 23 weeks. The clinic owner took the baby, who was gasping for air, cut her umbilical cord, threw her into a biohazard bag, and put the bag in the trash. Heartbroken, Ms. Williams later had a funeral for her baby girl, who she named Shanice. CNN has reported since that Ms. Williams suffers PTSD from that ordeal. Madam Speaker, why are these live births from abortion little known? Dr. Willard Cates, former head of the Centers for Disease Control Abortion Surveillance Unit, said several years ago, and I quote him, "Live births are little known because organized medicine, from fear of public clamor and legal action, treats them more as an embarrassment to be hushed up than a problem to be solved. It's like turning yourself into the IRS for an audit," he went on. "What is there to gain? The tendency is not to report because there are only negative incentives." Madam Speaker, Philadelphia abortionist Kermit Gosnell, one of the few who got caught, and it was under a state law, not federal, and many states don't have such laws. He was convicted for murder, for killing children who were born alive after attempted abortions. The grand jury report described it in this way, and I quote, "Gosnell had a simple solution for the unwanted babies he delivered. He killed them. He didn't call it that. He called it ensuring fetal demise. The way he ensured fetal demise was by sticking scissors in the back of the baby's neck and cutting the spinal cord, a practice he called snipping. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act seeks to end or at least mitigate this egregious child abuse by requiring that a health care provider must exercise the same degree of professional care, diligence to preserve the life of that child as they would a child of similar age. The bill empowers the woman upon whom the abortion is performed to obtain appropriate civil relief. And I'm sure had it been available then, Ms. Williams would have done that as well. This is humane, pro-child, human rights legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 26. H.R. 26 is presented within the context of what happened last year when the Supreme Court stripped millions of women in our country their status and free right for equal access to reproductive freedom. As members of Congress, we have a responsibility to correct this wrong and bring back reproductive freedom for women. This bill is not about the safety of children. This is more of the same. This is about policing the bodies of women. A bunch of middle-aged guys in Brooks Brothers suits stand here today and try to tell women what to do with their bodies. That's what this is about. This is not about the safety of children. That's already illegal. So I stand here to oppose H.R. 26. There are 64 million women across America that have reproductive age. They live here, in many of them, in states that are beating up on their rights to reproductive freedom. I stand here in opposition to H.R. 26 and ask my colleagues also to vote against it.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield 1 minute to my friend, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Thank you, Chairman.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. Thank you, Madam Chair. Once again, we have to say, how did we get to where we are today? How did we get to where we have to have a debate to defend life that survives the heinous practice of abortion? In the words of the infamous words of the governor of my very state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, just a few years ago, that governor said if a baby survives an abortion attempt, the mother and the doctor would have a conversation while they kept the baby comfortable to decide what to do with it. He said that on air in a radio broadcast. I realize that the other side may not recognize the science of conception. I realize that the other side may not share what the premium or the value of innocent life in the womb that most Americans have. The party of death that believes in abortion up until the moment of birth at any time for any reason. Today we find ourselves even having to defend and protect life, a baby that survives an abortion attempt. If it were not so, if it were not true, then this bill should pass unanimously. But I fear that will not be the case, for this same party will not even vote today, later today, against and condemn the violence at pregnancy centers across the country.
The gentleman's time
I
has expired.
encourage everyone to support this bill and protect all life.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Kamala Gerdove.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 26. We didn't hop in a time machine back to the 1970s. It's 2023, and we all know what this is about. It is not about the protection of newborn children. It's about control. It's about Republicans' continued desire to control women, take away their freedoms, limit their bodily autonomy, plunge poor women deeper into poverty, and further marginalize those already not seen. It's about intimidating, silencing, and criminalizing doctors. It's about the nationwide abortion ban that Republicans have been itching to enact since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Bans that the American people have said loudly and clearly that they do not want. We cannot continue to let the extreme Republican Party attack and erode the rights of women across this country. We have a responsibility to put an end to politicians inserting themselves into the doctors' offices and uteruses of women across this country. I urge my colleagues to vote against this measure. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Mr. Jordan, I rise in support of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Look, once again, House Republicans are eager to stand for the most vulnerable among us, the unborn. We are the party of life, and we're proud of it. There is no difference between an infant born alive after a failed abortion and an infant born into the arms of loving parents. And those two babies deserve to be treated with the same level of excellent medical care. Yet abortionists have demonstrated a lack of interest in preserving the lives of babies who enter the world alive and supposedly under their care. We know what happens in these clinics. By way of just one quick example, lifenews.com reports that an abortion provider in Minnesota was recently asked by a woman 22 weeks pregnant and considering abortion what that provider would do if her baby were taken out while his heart was still beating. The abortion provider responded, quote, "We don't tell women this, but if we were to proceed with the abortion and the baby was to come out still alive, most likely we would break its neck," unquote. That is chilling. That is barbaric. But our Democratic colleagues will not admit that, and they will not vote against it today. Watch the board. It will be shocking, and it will be true. The Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act would make it a federal crime for abortionists to kill or fail to provide care to babies who survive abortions. I encourage all of our colleagues to support this critical legislation. As it said, it should pass unanimously, but it won't. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Michigan, Representative Skolten.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of parental and maternal rights and in opposition to H.R. 26. I'm the first mother in history to represent West Michigan in Congress. This matter is deeply personal to me. I recently shared publicly about my own experience navigating a complex miscarriage and the loss of my daughter. As a pro-choice Christian who chose life, this issue is so personal to me. My faith informs my actions, but it doesn't dictate the policy of an entire nation. And further, when I read the scripture, I turn to passages and I'm guided by passages like Jeremiah 1 verses 5, which states, I knew you before I formed you and I placed you in your mother's womb. It doesn't say the government's womb or the speaker's womb. It says the mother's womb. I believe life is precious, but I reject the idea that if I embrace the sanctity of life, I also must be forced to invite the federal government in to regulate it. We must protect families from unnecessary government intrusion into the most sacred and personal decisions of our lives and our children's lives. Thank you.
The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
The gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. All life is sacred. Defending innocent lives should not be a policy issue. This legislation protects babies who are not only born, but who are then left without care from an attempted abortion. A baby who survives an abortion should receive the same medical attention that any other premature baby would. These precious souls are given another chance at life. It is unacceptable that there are no criminal charges for those who want to take their life away. The people who allow babies to be killed after birth must be fully prosecuted. Let's be clear. Killing a baby who is born alive, regardless of an attempted abortion, is murder. The previous Democrat-controlled House has refused to vote on this bill. Today, a Republican-led majority keeps our commitment to America by voting on legislation that upholds the sanctity of life. I urge the passage of this bill on the House floor, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio for yielding. Just a couple of minutes ago, we heard a speaker on the other side of the aisle criticize Republicans, saying we don't support wearing masks, and wearing masks affect others. However, having an abortion affects only a woman. So what is an abortion? What is an abortion? It's the intentional taking of the life of an unborn child. How in the world can you say that an abortion does not affect anyone except the woman? That's the core of the difference between those of us who support unborn children and born children. Those who support abortions ignore the fact that another life is involved. And that is the core of the issue. There are two lives involved here, the mother and the unborn baby. We must recognize that. I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We have one additional speaker who is momentarily going to be stepping out of the cloakroom and I would yield Mr. Klein from Virginia. Oh, I take that back, Madam Speaker. I think we're ready to close.
The gentleman from
We
Ohio
have one
reserves.
more speaker, and then we're prepared to close.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to H.R. 26 and urge my colleagues to instead support my motion to recommit to take up and pass Representative Judy Chu's Women's Health Protection Act that will restore the protections that we had under Roe v. Wade. If there's one thing this last election showed us, it's that the American people believe strongly that every woman in this country should have the ability to make her own health care decisions, including abortion. Sadly, however, if there's one thing this past week showed us, It's that the House Republicans just don't care at all about that. They don't care that 61% of the American people strongly support a woman's access to abortion care. They don't care that just 2 months ago, a record number of Americans showed up at polling locations across the country to overwhelmingly reject the GOP's plan to criminalize abortion care. They don't care that in every state where abortion restrictions were on the ballot, they were rejected overwhelmingly in places like Kansas. They don't care that Americans think that people, not politicians, should be making these decisions. Apparently, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle think they know how abortion decisions should be made, not a woman and her doctor. So instead of taking heed of the will of the American people, my Republican colleagues are intending to do just the opposite. The legislation before us today is part of a concerted effort to fast-track this extreme agenda of anti-choice legislation. It creates new criminal penalties for healthcare providers that fail to provide specific standards of care that the politicians on the other side of the aisle will enact after an attempted abortion. And so it doesn't really protect newborn children in any way. Why? Because if a child is born, it is already illegal to kill it, as it should be. And unlike what the majority leader said, it's already illegal in every single state in this country. It's illegal to kill people in this country. But just in case anybody was confused about this, as Chairman Nadler said, in 2002, Congress passed the Born Alive Act, and all of us, including me, the co-chair of the pro-choice caucus, voted for it because clearly, if the baby's born, we shouldn't kill it, duh. So what does this bill do? What it does, as I said, it creates criminal penalties for healthcare providers that don't do what the Republicans think they should do, and it creates new complicated standards that will make it harder for healthcare professionals to do their jobs. I ask for another minute, Mr. Chair.
I yield the gentlelady another minute.
So what it does is it hopes to deter doctors from providing abortion care in the first place, which is exactly what we saw after the Dobbs decision. This is not what the American people signed up for, folks. I strongly urge my colleagues to reject these extreme measures and instead to support my motion to recommit to take up and pass the Women's Health Protection Act to ensure that everybody in this country, no matter where they live, has the access to the reproductive care they ask. I ask unanimous consent, Madam Speaker, to add the text of my amendment to the record immediately prior to the text of the motion to recommit to the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
James, should we have objected to that? Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from the great state of Virginia, Mr. Klein.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the gentlelady for her remarks. I'm a little bit confused, though, because it wasn't before 2002 when our previous governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam, said on a radio show that if a baby was born alive, that the baby would be made comfortable, that then a conversation would ensue between the doctor and the mother about whether or not and how to treat that baby. Essentially saying, if you want to go ahead and kill your baby after it's born, go right ahead. That type of attitude persists, continues, and if there are laws that exist to prevent it, the governor was not aware of them, I'm not aware of them, that would apply in that situation. That's why this legislation is so important, because contrary to House Democrats and the Biden administration, the American people overwhelmingly believe that babies who are born alive should be protected, that a baby born alive, even after an attempted abortion, should be afforded the same constitutional protections as every other American, and I'm proud to support the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which would require appropriate medical care for children who survive abortion procedures, and it imposes strong criminal penalties for the failure to provide such care. So if a doctor, like our former governor, Dr. Northam, was back then, if he was engaging in the activities that he spoke about on that radio, he would be subject to those same criminal penalties. Protecting living and breathing babies outside the womb should not be a partisan issue. It should be one around which we all should unite, and I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized. Is reserves? Okay. The
Madam
gentleman from New
Speaker,
York.
I end this debate by reiterating the point I made at the beginning. This legislation would do nothing to enhance protections or the quality of health care if an infant is born after an attempted abortion. It has always been against the law to intentionally kill or harm a newborn infant, whatever the circumstances of its birth. It has always been against the law not to afford such an infant appropriate medical care. The bill does nothing new to protect infants. The bill, however, is not harmless. Rather, if enacted, it could place the lives and health of newborn infants at risk. The bill directly interferes with a doctor's medical judgment and dictates a medical standard of care, namely immediate transport to a hospital, that may not be appropriate in the particular circumstances. That is why a broad coalition of healthcare provider groups, joined by a wide range of additional health, civil rights, and women's rights groups, strongly opposes this bill. We should listen to these healthcare professionals. We should support keeping babies alive, which is what the Republicans say they want to do, but yet they have this legislation that would endanger babies' lives by dictating a standard of care that may not be appropriate in certain situations. We should listen to these healthcare professionals. This legislation is just another step in Republicans' plan to criminalize abortion nationwide. The House must reject this seriously flawed bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would just say that the document that launched this experiment in freedom we call America, the Declaration of Independence, talks about all are created equal, endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it's interesting. I think we all probably think it's the order the founders placed the rights they chose to mention. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. You can't pursue happiness. You can't chase down your goals and dreams if you first don't have freedom. And you don't have freedom, true liberty, unless government protects your most fundamental right, your right to live, your right to breathe, your right to life. That's what this legislation is about, protecting the most innocent, the most vulnerable's right to life. I urge a yes vote and hope this thing passes unanimously. With that, I yield back.